In the Pacific battles of World War II, much of the publicity went to the aircraft carriers and the naval aviators who flew from their decks. Yet, as important as the carriers were, the most significant naval warships in actually prosecuting the war toiled in almost complete obscurity. While battles like Midway, Santa Cruz, and Leyte Gulf grabbed the headlines, the Pacific Fleet submarine force quietly went about the task of isolating Japan.
The submarine was something that not too many people knew about. It was called the silent service, and it was a silent service. Nobody talked about where they went or when they went, so we had the advantage of the other side not knowing when or where we were at. That's the main thing why we were so successful.
American submarines crippled Japan's industry and prevented resupply and reinforcement of Japanese island garrisons by destroying most of her merchant fleet.
I think it was 1,178 merchant ships and 214 naval ships. And we had a total tonnage that was over 5.25 million tons, which was a tremendous amount when you consider the fact that most of Japan's ships were well under 12,000 tons.
But as decisive as the submarine's contribution was, the victory could have been even more complete. Hampered by a flawed pre-war doctrine and serious shortcomings in the Mark 14 torpedo, success during the first 2 years of war was disappointingly low. It took months for these problems to be resolved, but once they were, the United States Navy's submarine force, at first trained to play a junior role in its own service, revolutionized naval warfare. Today's nuclear-powered submarines are among the most technologically sophisticated machines ever built, combining advanced computer systems, precision navigation, sensitive sonar equipment, and devastating hitting power into one of the world's most lethal and stealthy weapons. The adaptations and inventions that allowed sailors to not only fight a battle, but also to live for months at a time underwater include some of the most brilliant developments in military history. Submarines have been used for warfare in one form or another since the American Revolution, but it was not until World War I that the combination of diesel engines, battery power, and self-propelled torpedoes made them a significant threat. All of the world's major navies included submarines in their fleets, but it was the Germans who would first exploit the versatility of the submarine in open ocean warfare. In response to a sea blockade of her ports by Great Britain, Germany implemented a submarine blockade of the British Isles, but was constrained by the international law of the sea, which required blockading ships to board and search ships suspected of carrying forbidden cargo. Crewmen aboard guilty vessels would be allowed to man lifeboats, and then the ship would be sunk. In 1916, however, the German Kaiser ordered unrestricted submarine warfare, which allowed submarines to torpedo ships believed to be forcing the blockade without formalities like announcing their presence. British shipping losses went up, and so did those of the United States, that was shipping large amounts of food, raw materials, and munitions to the British and French. Germany's use of unrestricted submarine warfare was denounced as brutal and uncivilized by the Allies and by the American press. The most notorious attack occurred when a German submarine torpedoed the British ocean liner Lusitania. The huge ship sank in just 18 minutes, killing 1,198 of the nearly 2,000 people aboard, among them 128 Americans. The incident was used to turn American public opinion against Germany and was an important issue that helped push the United States into the war. Though the Germans ultimately lost, they had demonstrated the effectiveness of submarine warfare against merchant shipping. After the war, the U.S. Navy looked to improve the capabilities of its submarine fleet, but existing technology proved a limiting factor. S-class boats, built between 1920 and 1925, were designed primarily for coastal defense purposes, not to cruise vast expanses of ocean. Though significantly larger than their predecessors, stowage space aboard was extremely limited and living quarters cramped beyond comfort. Derisively called pig boats by their crews, S-boats more than lived up to their nickname. While designers worked to improve functional capabilities, strategists sought to address questions of identity and mission. Two competing interpretations of submarine doctrine emerged. One camp foresaw submarines employed in a fleet support role, the other as an economic warfare arm of its own, modeled on the German successes of the First World War. However, American naval thinking was oriented towards fighting other navies, which left commerce raiding with no real place in strategic planning or training. It was determined that U.S. Navy submarines would fight other warships, and under the guidelines imposed by the 1930 London Naval Conference, would not attack merchant ships without first providing warning. Though this attitude negatively impacted tactical training in the years leading up to World War II, long-range strategic planning proved critical to the development of submarine technology. The rise of Imperial Japan had been a cause of increasing concern in the West since the turn of the century. Anticipating an eventual war, the United States developed War Plan Orange, which relied heavily on battleships but included submarines as scouts for the fleet.
They would go out and form a picket line in front of the main fleet. You'd see the enemy fleet showing up. They'd take a couple shots at them as they went by. They would radio back and let the main fleet know they were on their way. Many of the generals after World War I were thinking that it was going to be like Jutland, where you'd have all the huge battleships and battle cruisers firing away at each other for a couple minutes and see who came out the least bruised, and everybody'd go home. And of course, then the submarine would still be out there in the picket lines, and after they had this big exchange, this decisive battle, they would pick off the stragglers as they went back. So they anticipated that as the role for this submarine. The problem was that was how things happened in 1917 in Jutland. That's not how they were going to happen in 1937 or 40.
American submarine designers set out to produce a sub that would combine long-range cruising capabilities and a surface speed in excess of 20 knots with the very latest in technical advances.
We had the S-boats originally, and the S-boats were basically like the German submarines. And so we tried to develop what we call fleet submarines, which are designed to operate with the fleet. And so they were longer range and bigger submarines and more capabilities.
The Barracuda class, the first of a series of subs originally thought to meet the fleet boat criteria, proved less than ideal, and the Argonaut class, which followed in 1928, possessed the range but was able only to achieve an unacceptable 15 knots. The Narwhal class, commissioned in 1930, didn't perform much better. Although improvements were seen in the performance of the Dolphin and Cachalot classes, which appeared in 1932 and 1933 respectively, there remained a seemingly insurmountable problem. The diesel engines powering all these craft simply didn't measure up. The solution finally appeared when diesel engines developed for railroad locomotives proved both powerful and reliable enough to meet fleet requirements. Employing diesel-electric motors for the first time, the P-class submarines, constructed between 1935 and 1936, marked a tremendous improvement over the previous candidates, with a surface speed of 19 knots and a range of 10,000 miles. In a departure from earlier designs, the engines were coupled to a large generator rather than propeller shafts, making it possible to use the full power output to drive the boat, charge the batteries, or for a combination of the two. When the boat was submerged and diesels had to be shut down, the batteries provided all necessary power. All welded construction became standard beginning with the P-class, producing a much stronger hull that allowed the boat to dive to 300 feet. The 1938 Submarine Officers Conference sought to improve on the P-class by refining fleet requirements. In addition to 6 forward and 4 stern torpedo tubes and more reload torpedoes, it was recommended that the next class include an improved torpedo data computer, a longer, thinner periscope, a 5-inch deck gun, and the ability to cruise at fleet speed on voyages of 12,000 miles. Habitability was to be improved by the addition of freshwater distillation units and air conditioning. The Navy got all that and more with the Tambor class, a submarine that at last possessed the speed and firepower necessary for a fleet boat. Capable of 21 knots surfaced and 10 submerged, they could crash dive to periscope depth in under a minute. With good seakeeping, great handling, and excellent habitability, the 300-foot-long Tambor class provided sufficient elbow room for long war patrols. The U.S. Navy's first fleet sub had come of age.
The foresight of our building submarines in 1938 that would go across the Pacific Ocean and back, round trip, signified that our leaders knew there was a potential hazard and a potential conflict coming up with Japan. There was no other enemy in that area.
The Tambor class, consisting of the submarines Tambor, Tautog, Thresher, Triton, Trout, and Tuna, would eventually make a combined 70 war patrols and sink 80 enemy ships. The average of 13 ships per submarine was unmatched by any other class of boat. USS Tautog became the fleet's leading ace, with 26 Japanese ships to her credit. In 1940, the follow-on to the Tambor class appeared. Gato-class submarines were fast, heavily armed subs, well suited for an undersea war against Japan. At 312 feet long, Gatos comfortably accommodated a crew of 80. They could make 20 knots on the surface and nearly 9 submerged, and were equipped for journeys of 10,000 miles or more. Gatos and their immediate successor, the Balao class, became the bane of Japanese merchant ships during World War II.
They were faster, longer range, and a lot more torpedoes, and a lot thicker hull. Our diving depth, Pollock was a riveted submarine, and the P-class was the last of the riveted submarines because they went to welded hulls after that. And she was a thin hull build. Our test depth was 250 feet. The new boats were 550 up.
With 6 tubes forward and 4 tubes aft, Gato-class subs could carry up to 24 torpedoes. Its primary weapon, the Mark 14 torpedo, had an alcohol-powered steam turbine engine that could propel it at 46 knots for up to 4 miles.
A beautiful piece of mechanism, those torpedoes. When you consider how they worked with the steam in them, with the burning of the alcohol, with the propulsions that they developed from that pressure, it was just a tremendous piece of equipment.
The Mark 14's 668-pound warhead was detonated by the Mark 6 Influence Exploder, a device the Navy believed would revolutionize submarine warfare.
The magnetic exploder mechanism, which was a super secret device that was supposed to detonate the torpedo if it came in proximity with any large mass of steel.
Yet in spite of the improvements made to American submarines, the U.S. Navy submarine force was woefully unprepared for the type of warfare they were about to face. On December 7, 1941, there were 50 submarines attached to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. 21 were stationed at Pearl Harbor and 29 at Manila Bay. Of these, a number were the earlier S-class boats built in the 1920s. Only 4 were in Pearl Harbor at 7:55 a.m. when the Japanese began their attack.
I heard all this explosion like everybody else, and I thought, my goodness, can't they leave us alone on Sunday morning? We thought the Navy was practicing. They told me to get up on my gun, which was right up the next deck above me, and I was a gun captain on a 5-inch 25 anti-aircraft battery, and we had 50 rounds of ammunition up, and we started firing like everybody else. We fired everything that was flying. We got credit for 4. But who knows, the whole world was shooting.
In little more than 2 hours, the Japanese caused personnel losses of more than 2,400 killed and 1,200 wounded, sank 4 battleships and damaged 4 more, sank or damaged 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, 1 mine layer, and destroyed 188 aircraft. In the aftermath of the devastating attack, no surface fleet of any consequence remained in the Pacific.
When Pearl Harbor happened, the Japanese didn't bother with the submarines. The submarine base was just a short distance away from Battleship Row.
In fact, a couple of the guys on the boat said, yeah, they waved to us. They had their cockpits slid back and they would wave and smile and drop their torpedoes and go. And then right beyond the submarine base was our main Pacific oil storage tanks. They didn't hit them either.
The loss of the battleship fleet greatly reduced the strength of U.S. naval forces in the Pacific and placed Navy planners in a situation they never anticipated. They now had only one weapon system immediately available to take the war to the enemy.
There was no other arms to send out to hold the enemy back or get back at the enemy other than the submarines.
The submarines carried the fight to the Japs until the surface fleet could repair their ships and get back on duty.
Just hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Harold Stark, the Chief of Naval Operations, ordered all available boats to immediately put to sea, and for those already underway to conduct unrestricted submarine warfare against anything Japanese. Stark's call for unrestricted warfare meant that U.S. submarine commanders could now seek out and attack any ship flying the flag of the rising sun. However, this new strategy presented some serious problems. Prior to the war, tactical planning called for submarines to support the Navy's capital ships. That doctrine was now obsolete. Furthermore, training exercises for submarine warfare had emphasized offensive operations against swifter warships and not against the slower lumbering merchant vessels which they were now permitted to engage. It's not surprising then that the submarine campaign got off to a slow start.
The Navy had a Plan Orange that they had originally set up for the submarines part to work with the battle fleet. And that plan was no good, and it took quite a while for them to realize this, and it was the younger officers that came in there and took command that really showed them where they were wrong. And it was the older officers that have been taught that procedure, they had a problem breaking away from it.
Within days of the Pearl Harbor attack, the boats based in the Philippines had left Cavite on their first war patrols to seek out and destroy the expected Japanese invasion forces.
We went out the day the war started, at the 8th out there, and we went up off Formosa, off Ticao, Formosa. And see, that was a big naval base up there, Ticao. And we were supposed to observe ships going in and out of there and surface at night and report, you know, such and such a size ship, you know, going on course so-and-so and all that.
For Sturgeon and the other boats of the Asiatic Fleet, several factors combined to neutralize the effectiveness of these first war patrols. Caution first seemed to be the motto for many skippers, career officers who were generally older and more prudent. Few were willing to toss the pre-war rulebook by coming to periscope depth for an attack. Surface attacks were out of the question. Consequently, many of the early offensive maneuvers were made from the safety of deep water, using only passive sonar to determine range and bearing.
We fired at ships in there, but I mean, we never got a chance to actually come up and see them, you know? Whether they sank or not, you know, we never did know.
96 Mark 14 torpedoes were fired in 45 separate attacks over the first weeks of combat, but there were only 3 confirmed sinkings. Patrols originating from Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and the first 3 months of 1942 were credited with sinking a total of 19 enemy ships, but were hampered by tactical and operational instructions. USS Gudgeon's first foray into Japanese home waters illustrates the point. Her skipper was advised to remain submerged during daylight hours within 500 miles of her patrol area to avoid detection by aircraft. As a result, Gudgeon spent 27 days submerged during her 51-day patrol, and of these, only 12 were on station. En route back to Pearl Harbor, however, Gudgeon sank a Japanese submarine, the first enemy warship sunk by a U.S. Navy submarine in World War II. Although some early patrols mounted from Pearl Harbor targeted Japanese home waters, most were assigned the far less productive Japanese Pacific Islands and the China coast. While the lack of offensive initiative, flawed doctrine, and poor tactical positioning contributed to the slow start, they were only part of the problem. Defective torpedoes severely reduced the submarine fleet's effectiveness.
torpedo success was less than 50%. They were very bad. And that wasn't really corrected fully until late 43.
Premature explosions. Sometimes the torpedo would hit the ship and nothing would happen, no explosion. And erratic runs. By erratic runs, I mean they didn't go in the directions they were supposed to. They would run deeper or they would run shallower. And it was a very difficult time.
In the coming months, instances of inexplicable misses and dud hits began to accumulate. However, all attempts to raise the alarm through the chain of command were ridiculed by the Navy Bureau of Ordnance.
The powers that be were adamant that there was nothing wrong with the damn torpedo, because when they fired it under ideal conditions, it went off. But under wartime conditions, it did not go off.
That was due to just not having enough time to take the ships out before the war and practice with the firing and witness the results of the firings. They simulated a lot on paper and theory before we ever got into the war, and it should have been done the other way around.
The Mark 14 torpedo and its Mark 6 exploder had defects that tended to mask each other, faults that weren't revealed due to inadequate peacetime testing. It would be months before the problems were completely solved. In the interim, countless submarine crews put their lives in danger stalking enemy targets, only to be cheated of their quarry by defective torpedoes. The problems facing the American submarine fleet early in the war were numerous, but such was the case for the Allies throughout the Pacific. Beginning with the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan handed the United States and her allies a series of crushing defeats. Simultaneously with the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese moved against Malaya, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. On December 8th, an air raid on Clark Field in the Philippines destroyed most of the American Air Force stationed there before it ever left the ground. 2 days later, Japanese bombers flattened the Cavite Naval Station in Manila Bay, home of the U.S. Asiatic Fleet.
Nobody ever hears about, the beating they took out there, but they took a beating out there just like Pearl Harbor did, And, we wasn't in there. We was out when she got hit, Cavite got hit. But they got the Sea Lion there, and they put some holes in the Sea Dragon. The Sea Dragon got out of there, and she had some holes in it, but they patched it up and got her back all right.
With its facility ruined and practically no air cover, surface units of the Asiatic Fleet withdrew to Australia and the Dutch East Indies, where they would be out of range of Japanese aircraft on Formosa. Before the end of the year, the submarine force followed suit, abandoning the Philippines shortly after the Japanese came ashore at Lingayen Gulf, 300 miles northwest of Manila.
They told us to go into Exmouth Gulf, and they looked it up in the Coast Pilot, and in there it said, it didn't show nothing. It just showed the entrance, and then the line stopped, and all this was, nobody knew what it was, We're supposed to go in there. And they said that the last time anybody had been in there was in 1800 and something, and at that time the natives were friendly.
As the Asiatic Fleet struggled to regroup, the Japanese overran Burma, Malaya, and Thailand. Only Java in the Dutch East Indies had yet to be conquered. U.S. submarines attempted to stem the tide by attacking the invasion forces, but to no effect. Java fell in little more than a week. By the end of March 1942, Japan had achieved nearly all of her pre-war objectives. After the loss of the East Indies, U.S. submarines of the Asiatic Fleet withdrew to Perth Fremantle on the southwest coast of Australia. Since the outbreak of war, they had managed to sink only 10 enemy vessels, 8 merchants, a destroyer, and an aircraft ferry. Of the original 29 Manila boats, 4 had been lost. The U.S. High Command decided to leave the remaining submarines of the Asiatic Fleet down under, rather than withdraw them to Pearl Harbor. This was due in part to the decision to divide the Pacific into separate command areas. General Douglas MacArthur assumed command of the Southwest Pacific area, which included the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Borneo, Australia, New Guinea, and the western part of the Solomon Islands. Admiral Chester Nimitz would command the northern, central, and southern Pacific from Oahu. Submarines based in Australia would be well positioned to attack Japanese supply lines between Southeast Asia and the home islands, or support offensive operations in either area. By April 1942, the submarine force in Australia numbered 31 boats, with 20 at Perth Fremantle and 11 at Brisbane. The Fremantle force was meant to deploy against Japanese supply lines in the Southwest Pacific, as well as to undertake special missions ordered by General MacArthur to pick up and deliver personnel and supplies behind enemy lines.
We would come in to an island at night, submerged, and then just surface enough to get our conning tower and our decks awash. And then the commandos could get their kayaks out. And then at night they would row into the islands, and believe it or not, they would count the Japanese that were on the island.
Intelligence gathering missions, whether visual, photographic, or by landing party, were an essential fleet support role throughout the war. Few Marines ever set foot on a shore that hadn't first been reconnoitered by a submarine. In late April, the Japanese mounted a dual seaborne thrust to occupy Tulagi in the Solomon Islands and to complete their conquest of New Guinea by seizing Port Moresby. Tulagi fell without a fight, but 2 American carrier task forces intercepted the Port Moresby force. It was the first time in history that aircraft carriers fought each other. During the Battle of the Coral Sea, American air groups from Yorktown and Lexington sank the light Japanese carrier Shoho and inflicted damage on the large Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, but sustained damage to Yorktown and lost Lexington.
The Coral Sea was considered a tactical defeat because we did lose one heavy fleet carrier as opposed to the Japanese losing just a small carrier. It did contribute significantly to altering the strategic direction of the war because it turned back the Japanese invasion force. And it so decimated the air groups on board Shokaku and Zuikaku that it really prevented them from participating in the upcoming Japanese operation, which turned out to be the Battle of Midway.
During the Battle of the Coral Sea, 4 submarines stationed in Brisbane were able to attack elements of the Japanese invasion force, but their only confirmed kill was a mine layer. 3 weeks after the battle, Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood assumed command of the Fremantle force. His first order of business was to verify growing evidence that the Mark 14 torpedo was malfunctioning, and tests revealed that the Mark 14 ran 10 feet deeper than it was set for. Skippers were advised to adjust running depth accordingly, but the number of sinkings remained disturbingly low. Continuing on the belief that the poor showing was due to ineffective skippers, many were relieved of their commands.
At the beginning of the war, there were some that didn't seem aggressive, and they didn't because of the dud torpedoes. After you fired, made your proper runs and so forth, and your calculations and all are right, and you hear the duds go off, you really hesitate to go in there when you know they are heavy escorts and the chances are much slimmer of you getting a hit. And I think that had more to do with it than them being anything but good skippers.
Just before the Battle of the Coral Sea, it was agreed to begin exchanging submarines between Australia and Pearl Harbor so that Fremantle's boats could return to the United States for refitting. During the transit to Australia, the Pearl Harbor submarines would undertake war patrols off Japanese-held islands. Under this arrangement, and augmented by newly commissioned boats arriving from the United States, war patrols from Pearl Harbor increased sharply during April and early May 1942.
Once we were underway, everybody had a job to do. They had a station to be on. If they were like myself, I'm order machinist Matt, you were either in the engine room or in the auxiliary room doing your job, what you're supposed to be doing in your line of work. And then you were assigned like 4 hours on and 8 hours off. And it went on just around the clock that way.
And a lot of people think 85 men, 60 days at sea, but you only saw a third of them because we were split up into 3 sections. And once you got settled down to a sea routine, your section was really the only ones you saw. Section on duty, that's what they were, on duty. And you didn't let anything distract you. Because just a slip, you could put yourself in real trouble.
It was totally demanding. It required every ounce of your energy and your strength, mental and physically. And even sometimes you felt inadequate then.
Under such extreme conditions, the level of military courtesy and discipline on board was far more relaxed than on a surface ship.
We are pretty kind of lax. We wear sandals, and we have jeans that we cut short, and we have guys that wear a beard and earrings.
There wasn't any stuffiness, you know. We called them sir, or Mr. So-and-so, their name. Or the captain, he was always called the captain, you know. It was such a wonderful association.
While a newcomer on board might have had difficulty distinguishing between the captain and his crew, one aspect of the submarine service clearly stood out.
They got the best food in the armed services in World War II. They always set out with, you know, frozen cuts of meat and whatnot, which of course were rationed at home, and the guys that were out in the field and, you know, Marines digging in here and guys going through the Battle of the Bulge didn't see sea rations or something like that.
We always asked for the best that we could ask for. For example, filet mignon. They'd come in 50-pound boxes. They were all boneless. We didn't have room for bones. So everything was boneless, and we'd take them out of the packages. And in the wax paper, we'd put those in the freezer, and that's what we would operate on.
When we left port, we ate like a king. And after about 20 days, it was getting kind of bad, and if you couldn't run up to a supply ship, you was eating K rations.
As the patrol wore on, the deterioration of the food quality was rivaled by the foulness of the atmosphere.
The average age of submariners in World War II was 19. That's the average age, which basically means it's a bunch of high school kids that are operating the most technically advanced, you know, vessel of war that exists in the world. So if you can imagine yourself stuck with 80 guys, all of which are about teenage or high teenage years, that are actually doing heavy labor down in the South Pacific, going through drills, everybody's got smelly feet, the whole deal, they're not really changing their clothes too much, and you only get to shower about every 2 weeks. Now you can start to imagine what the smell on this thing would have been like when you combine that with hydraulic fluid and diesel fuel and whatnot.
Though the increase in patrol frequency during the spring of 1942 improved the chances of success, the numbers returning from the battlefront continued to dismay fleet commanders. The Pearl Harbor boats were credited with sinking only 33 enemy ships between January and May 1942. Tellingly, the greatest success came on patrols to Japanese home waters and the East China Sea. Stakeouts of Japanese bases in the Central Pacific continued to yield meager results.
Warship is kind of hard to tangle because they go too fast for the sub. By the time you see them, they're gone. You have to be lucky to be right in front and to cross your path.
In mid-May, Navy code-breaking efforts provided advance warning of a major Japanese offensive aimed at Midway Island, just 700 miles from Pearl Harbor. Admiral Nimitz immediately deployed his 3 remaining aircraft carriers to intercept, and the result is often described as the turning point of the Pacific War. Though a major success for American surface units, the Battle of Midway was an exercise in frustration for U.S. submariners.
Early in the war, we found that we were not as effective as we might be trying to operate with the fleet. At Midway was a good example. We had a huge number of submarines there trying to intercept the Jap fleet, and only one of them even attacked a ship.
19 boats had sortied from Pearl Harbor, but confusion, indecision, and poor contact reporting spoiled what might have been a signature battle for U.S. submarines. It was late on June 6th, with the battle largely over thanks to devastating air attacks launched from Hornets, Yorktown, and Enterprise, that the USS Nautilus fired 4 torpedoes at a disabled Japanese carrier. True to form, 1 failed to run, 2 ran erratically, and the 4th was a dud. The experience of the submarine force operating at Midway was disheartening, but later, as the number of available submarines swelled and the war moved into more confined waters with distinct shipping routes, the submarine's fleet role would be proven with devastating effect. Hoping to build on the shift in momentum that occurred at Midway, U.S. Marines of the 1st Division invaded Guadalcanal in early August. It was America's first offensive operation of the war. The campaign to secure the island lasted 6 months, and for much of its course, the balance teetered precariously from one side to the other. Consequently, the Southwest Pacific Submarine Force in Australia was regularly assigned interdiction missions in support of the Solomons effort, seeking to prevent the Japanese from reinforcing their island garrisons by sea. So critical was the Guadalcanal campaign that submarine squadrons 8 and 10 were transferred from Pearl Harbor to Brisbane, which then boasted the largest concentration of U.S. submarines in the Pacific. However, the resulting dilution of effort left only Lockwood's Fremantle boats and roughly half of the Pearl Harbor submarines to actively engage enemy supply lines. As the disappointing 1942 wound to a close, a tally of the campaign to date revealed that U.S. submarines had destroyed a total of 147 Japanese ships, or less than half a ship per patrol. Of these, only 2 were major warships. Significantly, missions to Japan, which numbered less than 1 in 5, accounted for nearly half of all the ships sunk. After the defeat at Guadalcanal early in 1943, the Japanese shifted their focus to defending what remained of their earlier conquests, while the Allies began developing a plan that would allow them to gain the offensive initiative. With war materiel of all kinds beginning to flow from the United States, the Allies were able to pursue a dual-pronged strategy. Forces under the command of General MacArthur would simultaneously attack the northern Solomons and leapfrog westerly along the coast of northern New Guinea, isolating Japanese garrisons stationed there and ultimately bypassing Rabaul. Admiral Nimitz would begin the drive across the central Pacific with invasions of Tarawa and Macon in the Gilbert Islands before proceeding further west across the Pacific toward Japan. Such ambitious plans would take some time to put in place, so again, it fell to the men of the Silent Service to keep the pressure on. By mid-spring 1943, the submarine force at Pearl Harbor, now under the command of Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, had grown to 50 boats. The main submarine's Pacific headquarters at Pearl Harbor and the advanced base at Midway hummed with activity as boats returned from patrols for refitting or set sail for the war zone. The base at Midway provided a fueling station 1,100 miles closer to Japan and did much to improve the logistical situation for SubPac. Between April and August, an average of 18 SubPac boats left each month for war patrols of 40 to 50 days. Notably, over half were targeted at enemy shipping in Japanese Empire waters and the East China Sea. This shift in deployment marked a significant change from the strategy that had continued to place a high priority on hard-to-target enemy capital ships in spite of poor results, and was further justified by the 4th War Patrol of the USS Wahoo. When the Gato-class submarine Wahoo arrived at Pearl Harbor in August 1942, she joined a submarine force struggling to find success. Her first 2 patrols were marked by attack failures, but when charismatic Lieutenant Commander Dudley Mush Morton assumed command at the end of the year, her fortunes and the rest of the submarine fleets began to change. Personable with his crew and aggressive in his leadership, Morton reorganized Wahoo's patrol procedures. Wahoo transited to her 3rd Patrol's operating area on the surface in daylight despite the threat of Japanese planes. He trusted his executive officer, Richard O'Kane, to make all periscope observations during attacks, which allowed Morton to better evaluate the entire combat situation. As commanding officer of USS Tang, O'Kane eventually became the submarine force's leading ace of the war, credited with destroying 31 ships. Wahoo's 3rd Patrol and 1st under Morton netted 3 ships, but that was only the beginning. On his next patrol, Morton sailed into the shallow confines of the East China and Yellow Seas. In a series of slashing gun and torpedo attacks, Morton sent 9 ships to the bottom. It was by far the most successful patrol of the war to date and proved to be the turning point of the Pacific Submarine War. Inspired by Morton's tactics and innovation, other commanders began to adapt Wahoo's aggressive style and take the fight to the enemy.
These were all younger officers. I think that they set the whole procedure of submarine warfare. Those people did, not the Navy.
As far as doctrine that we had been schooled in, as far as the depth that we would travel, when we would put the periscope up and that sort of thing, this was developed in the field by our own skippers and breaking away from the old conservative, non-aggressive rules that had governed the way we acted.
The determination and character exhibited by Morton and the crew of Wahoo was hardly unique to that vessel. Just being accepted for submarine duty was a testament to these sailors' abilities.
In order to get into submarines, you had to pass a rigorous set of exams to show that you were very smart, to show that you had psychologically what it takes to live with 80 other guys for a little over 2 months on a war patrol without ever seeing the sun, in close quarters with very little privacy. So these guys had a lot of camaraderie. They had a lot of respect for each other.
The people that were involved in it, they were the cream of American crop. They were the finest physically adapted people and mentally, and they had a tremendous attitude.
It was a very elaborate and in-depth screening process. And to give you an example of the number of people who made it, there were 105 that volunteered with me, and there were like 6 of us passed. So it was an extremely difficult service, and it was all volunteer, 100% volunteer.
The elite group of men who formed the submarine force made up only 1.6% of the entire U.S. Navy. Each had received 50% more pay than the rest of their Navy comrades for their willingness to accept the hazards, rigors, and privations of service aboard a World War II-era submarine.
I first became aware of submarines when I was 10 years old, and from that day on I wanted to be a submariner. And I like to think most of them did. They went there for the money. It was nice. It was nice to get the extra money. But most of us there because that's what we wanted.
Service aboard a submarine was far different than in any other branch of the military in the Second World War. During a patrol that could last up to 10 weeks, most crewmen only rarely caught a glimpse of sky or the taste of fresh air, let alone actually setting foot on dry land.
You didn't know what day it was, you didn't know whether it was day or night, and you really didn't particularly care. You just had a job to do. And of course, also you had a sanitary problem because you had 80 men on there who hadn't had a bath in however long you were out.
Patrols weren't all glorious and a lot of fun. There was a lot of tedium and boredom, weeks at a time before you might see a target and break up the monotony. But I think the fact that we all suffered the same suffrages and the same glories and so on is what brought us all together.
Along with the monotony, training drills were another fact of life for submariners.
In our day, it took 5 men just to dive it or surface it, and it took about 20 to operate it. And it had to be done in unison, in perfect coordination, and just one mistake could cost the life of every man on the boat. And so you were very acutely aware of your responsibilities.
In order to attain the rating of qualified in submarines, each man in the crew of approximately 80 had to know how to perform every single job aboard a U.S. submarine, the most sophisticated and complex man of war at the time.
Every single person on this boat had a job to do, and if they didn't do their job, everyone else on the boat could literally die. Anyone from the captain right down to the cook had to know what every single thing did in every compartment. So if you were in that compartment when you underwent some kind of attack or there was some kind of emergency, you would know what to do in order to save the boat.
Of course, the very first patrol that you go out on, of course, you're a new man and you've really got to learn things. So it's up to you to find out what it's all about on board. You know, just really investigate and ask questions. And so you'll be able to qualify. So you will know your submarine and know what it's all about.
You had to make drawings of every system throughout the boat. Then an officer aboard would take you through the boat and question you on every compartment in the boat.
You had to qualify on each submarine that you served on. You had to re-qualify, even though the subs might be from the same shipyard, but you had to re-qualify. But when you got your Dolphins, I think you were the proudest man in the Navy.
The esprit de corps that developed among submariners was not entirely unique within the military. Elite units like airborne troops and close-knit groups like bomber crews or naval aviators shared a high level of camaraderie. Yet for these and virtually all other servicemen in World War II, the near certainty of death should disaster strike did not exist.
I think you come close to death so many times with each other that you just develop a brotherhood, I would say.
It's hard to describe, but you talk about families. I think we were even closer than families.
Everyone knew that their life depended on the man next to them, and everyone knew that the man next to them's life depended on them doing their job. So there was a huge amount of esprit de corps. The disadvantages, of course, were, first of all, as a proportion, this was the most risky arm of the armed services to serve in. Your chances of coming back on one of these alive were lower than any other thing you can think of. Daylight bombing raids over Germany, storming Iwo Jima with the Marines. Your chances were better of surviving those activities than it was to be on one of these submarines in World War II. They had a 24% casualty rate. It was very rare for men to actually survive any kind of damage or attack on a submarine. So if something went wrong, 80 guys just went to the bottom.
No one was immune to the inherent dangers of the submarine service. In the fall of 1943, Mush Morton and Wahoo returned to the Sea of Japan and went on a rampage, sinking at least 4 ships over the course of several days. While attempting to exit via La Perouse Strait, Wahoo was detected by Japanese anti-submarine aircraft, and a coordinated air and sea attack commenced. Morton and his crew of 79 men were never heard from again. Since he had assumed overall command of the Pacific Submarine Force early in 1943, much of Rear Admiral Lockwood's attention was consumed by nagging materiel problems. Foremost among these was torpedoes, not only a shortage of supply, but continuing evidence of serious malfunction. Lockwood's tests at Fremantle in mid-1942 established that U.S. torpedoes were running too deep, but after correcting the problem, torpedo performance failed to improve. Premature warhead detonations, believed to be the result of a too sensitive magnetic influence exploder, continued to bedevil the fleet. Lockwood convinced Admiral Nimitz to rely solely on the Mark 14's contact exploder. But even with the magnetic feature disabled, Pacific Fleet submarines continued to experience a significant percentage of duds.
I know one particular run we made, we fired 19 torpedoes and we could hear them hitting the hull. And we were being fired on from the direction the torpedoes were coming from. But we never got any damage done.
You never saw such a dejected bunch in your life as you did when 4 torpedoes were fired and the sound man heard 2 of them hit and none go off. It was frustration of the first order.
During a series of experiments conducted in Hawaii in September 1943, it was determined that when a torpedo struck at a 90-degree angle, which was considered ideal, the firing pin would buckle, which in some cases prevented it from contacting the exploder cap. Merely installing a stronger firing pin resolved the issue. With this simple modification, the performance of the Mark 14 torpedo finally reached acceptability, but it had taken half the war to get there. The ongoing shortage of torpedoes, a persistent problem early in the war, was remedied by the gradual introduction of the Mark 18 electric torpedo beginning in mid-1943. Although slower than the Mark 14 and somewhat limited in range, the Mark 18 left no telltale wake that could give away a submarine's position.
Almost invariably after you fired torpedoes, the escorts could see the torpedo tracks and they knew where the torpedoes came from. And they just run down the torpedo track expecting to find a submarine at the other end, and they usually would. And Japanese anti-submarine efforts were primarily passive or listening sonar rather than active sonar where you ping like our ASW efforts were largely. And Pollock wasn't as fast as the new submarines, but also she was very noisy. If they were going to be listening, the submarines that made the most noise were the ones they'd hear first, and that was us.
The primary anti-submarine weapon during World War II was the depth charge, a canister of high explosives set to go off at a predetermined depth.
The object being to have the depth charge go under the submarine so that the explosion came up. We used various and sundry methods of evading them if possible, and I'm living proof that we've evaded right many.
The first time to go through that is really terrifying. You hear 2 explosions. And of course, when the depth charge explodes, there's a space that's void that's left. And of course, that comes back in as soon as the explosion's completed. And you just don't know when the next one's coming.
During the first part of the war, the Japanese tended to set their depth charges too shallow, unaware that U.S. submarines could dive below 150 feet.
Early in the war, there was a fact-finding committee of congressmen sent out to the Pacific. And when they got back, one of them made the remark that our submariners didn't have anything to worry about. The Japanese weren't setting their depth charges deep enough. Well, the Japanese can read too. And I'd say in the next 6 months, we lost 10 submarines because they just started setting them deeper.
The tenacity of a depth charge attack was another important variable. With a full battery charge, a sub could remain submerged for over 36 hours. But by that point, it would be absolutely essential to surface and recharge.
If you were down for a prolonged period, the battery gets very low. You lose the benefit of the oxygen in the ship that you've been breathing up all day. It gets pretty foul below. And sometimes you're held down to practically the full limit of the battery, and possibly even some of our ships were lost because they could never get up in time to charge the battery and didn't have enough power to pull out of it.
More submarines were lost to depth charges during the war than any other cause, but the vast majority escaped to fight another day. Although the submarine squadrons at both Fremantle and Brisbane maintained a steady level of activity throughout 1943, Brisbane lost importance as the war moved up the Solomon's chain and westward into New Guinea. By late in the year, just 8 boats were stationed there, but an advanced base established at Milne Bay, New Guinea, put them 1,200 miles closer to their patrol areas. Between June and December, 33 war patrols sent to monitor the supply lines linking Truk, Rabaul, and Palau resulted in 29 confirmed sinkings. During that same period, the 22 submarines stationed at Fremantle sank nearly 50 enemy ships, a dozen of them oil tankers bound from Borneo and Sumatra.
The emphasis was switched pretty much to tankers, and we sank an awful lot of the Japanese merchant marine and tankers, and that's the thing, the argument about we shouldn't have dropped the atom bombs because we'd sunk all the Japanese tankers and they were running out of fuel.
Late in 1943, as MacArthur's forces hammered away at Japanese garrisons in New Guinea and the Northern Solomons, and the Marines in the Central Pacific were regrouping after the brutal invasion of Tarawa, Lockwood began deploying small, coordinated submarine wolf packs as tactical units.
With that kind of an operation, we could cover a larger area of the ocean. With 3 submarines out there, we could talk to each other on secure radio. And if one of the submarines picked up enemy convoy, well, they could tell the others. And then the Commodore could order the others into a position where he thought they might all have an opportunity to attack some of the ships in the convoy.
Communications and coordination among Wolfpack members at sea was often difficult, but during the last 2 years of the war, wolfpacking became increasingly common, particularly for commerce raiding north of Luzon, where several Japanese north-south convoy routes from the conquered territories converged.
The people in Pearl Harbor had laid out a checkerboard-like arrangement of areas, and we were given a certain sequence of movement where we would move from one area to another area to another area, and if we saw a convoy or some warships going through a part of our area that we didn't have time to get to, we could call Pearl Harbor. They could then notify other submarines in the other squares along which those ships were going to travel so that they could have an opportunity to attack them.
Along with tactical innovations that continued to evolve throughout the war, new boats arriving in the fleet added ever greater capabilities. Palau-class submarines, the first of the thick-skinned boats that integrated higher-strength steel in the pressure hull, were introduced in 1943. Almost identical in appearance to Gatos, the important difference was in design depth. The Palau class was rated to 400 feet, a full 100 feet deeper than Gatos could go. Tench-class boats, which began to appear in 1944, could exceed 600 feet.
They could go twice as deep as we could, and It took twice as long for the depth charges to get down there, and the depth charges are only half as accurate or less on the new fleet boats as the old ones.
Regardless of class, fleet submarines underwent a constant program of modification, much of which was carried out by submarine tenders, auxiliary ships specially equipped to perform maintenance and provide logistics support for submarines. The advantage of putting submarine supplies, spare parts, service facilities, and berthing on a surface ship was that it made them as portable as the submarines themselves. Setting up a new forward submarine base became almost as simple as dropping anchor.
When a submarine came alongside, maybe they had some problem with their motors or something, electric motors or something, and the machine shop could take care of those things, and the torpedoes or whatever. And then they also have food that they could take some food for them. And they always have a crate of oranges, fruit for them right away on they take out to the submarine. And we also had an ice cream making machine there in the on the tender for things like that. So like more supplies and repairs, small repairs, main function of the tender.
Fleet submarines back from the front often required little more than fuel and provisions, but just as often, major repairs were in order. Diesels were repaired or replaced, leaking bulkheads made fast, and electronic gear updated. The conning tower was often replaced during a refit to reduce its silhouettes and make the boat harder to see on the surface, and had the added benefit of decreasing the time it took to submerge.
55 seconds to get the boat submerged. That's what we were always striving for, is to close that hatch and get the conning tower, the periscopes below the surface in 55 seconds. If you're on the surface, well, you're kind of a sitting duck.
Since individual commanders were allowed to arm their boats pretty much as they wished, the original 3-inch 50 deck gun was generally replaced with something heavier, at first 4-inch 50s and later by a 5-inch 25 wet mount. Some boats carried a pair of 5-inch guns. 20mm guns were often replaced with 40mm Bofors mounted either fore or aft of the tower, and in some cases both. By war's end, few fleet boats were equipped exactly alike. With the refit complete, provisions and supplies were brought aboard and packed into any available space. Loading torpedoes was one of the most difficult parts of this process.
We would lift them from the dock or the ship or wherever was supplying us and put them on the skids of the torpedo room. And they were put down with chain falls, cables put on them to ease them down the skids. And many times the torpedo took a route of its own and continued down the skids, went into the tubes, went into the bilges, and all different directions, even though they were under some pretty tight control. And it was a very laborious operation, and it was a damn back-breaking operation was what it was.
With the boat reprovisioned, the submarine once again set sail for the war zone. Days later, after performing an endless series of drills that shaved precious seconds when submerging or surfacing, standing watch, manning battle stations, and performing their normal duties, the boat finally arrived at the patrol area. Early in the war, this would have meant long days spent underwater, hoping for enemy contact while waiting for nightfall to resurface and charge batteries. But ongoing improvements to the submarine's detection gear made that procedure a thing of the past. Though the electronic suite provided many benefits, the single greatest advantage American fleet submarines possessed over the Japanese was radio detection and ranging, or radar. From the very first days of the war, most American subs were equipped with a rather primitive setup called SD, which was non-directional and had a limited range of between 6 and 10 miles. SD was an air search system useful only in detecting enemy aircraft, but it did allow boats to operate on the surface even in daylight.
The biggest scare had to be airplanes, because them suckers, they would be real high and then they would come down, and your lookouts, you're watching the horizon. You're not looking straight up.
A new system, type SJ, first appeared in mid-1942 and was installed aboard all U.S. submarines by early 1943. Unlike SD, SJ radar was directional and provided the exact range and bearing of surface targets. Its reach was limited by the height of the retractable mast, but even so, targets could be electronically detected long before they were visually sighted. Ships that may otherwise have passed unnoticed were now exposed to submarine attack.
It's a great advantage, a very great advantage, because they were quite, in the beginning of the war, they didn't know that we had radar, so we had a big advantage over them, and we could operate at nighttime and during the storms and all that, and they did not have the advantage of knowing that we were there.
While the Japanese had superior night optics and excellent sound detection gear, only their carriers and battleships possessed radar, a fact that shifted the odds decisively in the direction of the Americans. Consequently, with the new SJ sets aboard, the submarine fleet developed a new method of attack known as the end-around.
We would pick up a Jap ship and we could plot their course and then go flank speed ahead and get ahead of them. And if we had to submerge in the daytime, why, we would submerge and wait for them to come by and knock them off. If it was at night, well, we'd stay on the surface and fire from the surface at night.
If we saw an airplane or heard an airplane, we would submerge, but we would stay on the surface as much as we possibly can because we could maneuver better. We had more speed to do what we needed to do to get around and take position to be able to fire torpedoes at the enemy ships.
Fire control, the process of tracking targets and aiming torpedoes, required far more than simply looking through the periscope. The immediate problem was determining the target's course and speed, a painstaking procedure made vastly easier by the torpedo data computer, a system that simultaneously tracked a target and adjusted the aim of the torpedoes. A series of periscope observations of the target's position, course, and speed were made, and as the fire control problem developed, the TDC provided increasingly accurate directional instructions to the torpedoes. A proper solution was usually obtained after 3 or 4 observations. Regardless of whether the torpedoes found their target, nearly every time a ship was attacked, Japanese escorts responded with depth charges. For the submarine, the best response was to immediately dive and commence silent running, a tactic that reduced the chances of detection by enemy sound listening gear by operating in a state of complete quiet.
Our operating depth then for depth charge attack was, depending on the water underneath, it was about 300 feet. And also depending on the cold stratus. If you were aware of a cold strata, you get below that at 100 feet. Their sonar wasn't any good. It wouldn't pick you up. It deflected the signal before it could get to you. But if you weren't aware of that, you just went to your test depth and stayed there.
Soundmen played a leading role in evading depth charges by determining the range and direction of pings sent by Japanese sonar emitters. The submarine would maneuver to put the attackers astern, then slowly withdraw from the area.
We evaded a lot of them, and I'm sure that later on, right many of the boats that got sunk were because they either didn't use that method of escape or they just weren't lucky enough to use it. I think that we were lucky.
Technical and tactical innovations combined to make 1943 a significantly better year for submariners. The fleet was credited with sinking 335 Japanese ships, or roughly twice the corresponding figure for 1942. More importantly, post-war analysis revealed that Japan's merchant fleet declined by 16% despite a vigorous shipbuilding program, and importation of bulk commodities diminished to 81% of the pre-war level. The loss of raw materials and petroleum and the inability to transport men and materiel to the front lines significantly reduced Japan's ability to maintain effective military strength. For Imperial Japan, World War II had become a battle of attrition, and the worst was yet to come. In 1944, the silent service finally hit its stride as the operational deployment of the submarine fleet was coordinated to match the strategic requirements of the war. When combined with improved torpedoes, better radar, new tactics, and an ever-increasing number of newly commissioned boats, it spelled doom for the Japanese merchant fleet. By the time Admiral Nimitz's cross-Pacific thrust reached the Marshall Islands in January 1944, the Pacific submarine fleet numbered nearly 100 boats, with 60 submarines assigned to Pearl Harbor and 36 to Australia. Boats of the Pacific and Southwest Pacific Fleet were kept busy supporting both the Marshall's campaign and U.S. carrier strikes against Truk, the most formidable enemy stronghold in the Pacific and forward anchorage for the Japanese Imperial Fleet.
We knew it was a strong, fortified situation, and a lot of us that had just heard about it, studied it a little bit. I'll have to admit, I was a little apprehensive about Truk, not having any idea what we were going to run into. We just knew there was a lot of stuff there.
Though concern regarding a strike on Truk was certainly justified, the operation turned into a rout. In 2 days and 1 night of attacks, the air groups of Task Force 58 sunk or incapacitated most of the ships and aircraft they found there. Though capital ships were absent, thousands of tons of vital merchant shipping succumbed to the torrent of bombs and torpedoes. When the raids were over, Truk lay in ruins, never again to pose a significant threat to the Allies. In the aftermath of the all-out assault on Truk in mid-February, the Imperial Navy fell back on the Palaus. By April, under growing pressure from naval and land-based air attacks, the fleet had dispersed to Davao and Tawi-Tawi in the southern Philippines, Surabaya on Java, and Singapore in Malaysia. With Navy codebreakers providing advance warning, numerous attempts were organized to intercept these Japanese withdrawals. Although a number of Japanese freighters and auxiliaries were sunk, the only major warships destroyed during these patrols were 3 light cruisers. Increased pressure on the Empire, East China Sea, and Kuriil Island supply routes paid bigger dividends. Operating from advanced submarine bases in New Guinea and on Majuro in the Marshalls, submarines of the Pacific and Southwest Pacific Fleet sank 183 ships, or nearly 750,000 tons of shipping in the first 4 months of 1944. With Truk eliminated and the Marshall Islands secure, Allied forces in the Central Pacific set their sights on the Marianas Islands of Saipan, Guam, and Tinian. From air bases on these islands, long-range B-29 bombers could reach Japan. Beginning on June 11th, carrier-based air groups mounted a series of powerful strikes on Saipan as a prelude to invasion. Submarines were deployed to interdict any Japanese attempts to reinforce the island and to provide lifeguard services for downed airmen, a procedure introduced for all large-scale fleet offensives beginning with the invasion of the Gilbert Islands in 1943.
There was hardly an airstrike that was made that didn't have submarines standing lifeguard duty then. We retrieved 6 pilots in all.
Anticipating an eventual move on the Marianas, the Japanese had prepared a plan that would exploit the longer range of their aircraft. Pilots would shuttle between carriers at sea and air bases on Guam and Saipan, hitting the Americans coming and going, while allowing their carriers to operate beyond the range of an American counterstrike. In mid-June, as the Marines fought their way ashore on Saipan, the remaining elements of the Imperial Fleet began to converge in the Philippine Sea for the decisive battle the Japanese had long sought. But they were not alone. American submarines detected and trailed the enemy forces, all the while relaying critical information to the American fleet off Saipan. When the Japanese launched their aircraft early on the morning of June 19th, they were flying into a trap. Few of their pilots survived to even attempt an attack on the American task forces covering the landing. By this point in the war, American air superiority made any engagement with the U.S. Navy nearly suicidal.
All of a sudden, my eyes practically bugged out. I saw a group of about 50, 60 enemy planes, all motley group, no formation type thing at all. Well, I started on down, I wagged my wings, and I started going down. All of a sudden, my eyes apparently were so big from seeing this grand opportunity that I saw another plane, another of our planes, had designs on that same plane that I was going for, and I'm sure we'd have collided if I hadn't aborted that particular pass. But anyway, I pulled back up again, and then I started. And you hear these stories of what guys were doing: go for the lead man, dive at the lead, and then break them all up. Well, there were just too many of them. We had to work fast because we weren't far from our fleet. And to me, you pick them off the edges.
And pick them off he did. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, subsequently dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Alex Verasu knocked down 6 Japanese dive bombers in a span of 8 minutes on his way to becoming one of America's leading aces. All told, the Japanese lost nearly 350 aircraft and 3 aircraft carriers, including 2, Taiho and Shokaku, which were sunk by U.S. submarines. Though a great success for naval aviation, the battle marked a high point for the submarine force working in concert with the fleet. Effective scouting, efficient communications, and intelligent handling, not to mention several smashing torpedo attacks, combined to give the submarine force a leading role in a victory that permanently crippled Japanese naval aviation. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American submarines refocused their efforts on enemy supply lines with renewed intensity and devastating effect. By late August, wolf packs appeared in Luzon Straits and the East China Sea from new Pacific Fleet submarine bases at Saipan and Guam. By the end of the year, they'd sent nearly 150 ships to the bottom. Meanwhile, boats of the Southwest Pacific Fleet patrolled the Japanese oil pipeline from Sumatra and Borneo from advanced bases at Manus in the Admiralty Islands and at Mios Wendy just east of Biak. In July through October alone, boats of the Southwest Pacific Fleet sank almost 100 enemy ships. When combined with the growing toll from air attacks, the effect on the Japanese war effort was catastrophic. Occasionally, the survivors of a submarine attack were taken prisoner, but these instances were relatively rare. Like their counterparts on land, most Japanese were reluctant to surrender.
In one case, we picked up a survivor and brought him aboard, and then they would set this enemy down at the table with maps and then start talking with these guys. And at night, having to watch in the galley, I was able to watch all of this stuff.
In mid-September 1944, the business of rescue took a grim turn for the crew of the USS Pomponido. Shortly after surfacing late on the 15th, the boat encountered a debris field, the result of an attack made 3 days earlier by Sea Lion. Clinging to the wreckage was a large number of men covered with oil and filth.
They got out on the deck with machine guns and whatnot to see if they couldn't take a prisoner or get some intelligence. And as they got very close to one of these rafts of men, they heard one of the men yell out, "Great, first you bloody Yank sink us, and now you're going to bloody shoot us." And at that point they realized, obviously they were speaking English, they must be friends of ours. And the story is that if you've ever heard of or seen the movie or the book Bridge Over the River Kwai, it talks about how the Japanese, after capturing Singapore, had taken those men in the army and actually used them as slave labor to build the Burma Railroad. Well, these men had actually been used for 2.5 years as slaves to build the Burma Railroad down in Southeast Asia. And the Japanese were actually transporting about 1,400 or 1,500 of them back to the mainland Japan to use as slave labor in those factories. They crammed them into one of the holds on one of the ships and one of the holds on a second ship. We did not know they were in there. And so, of course, encountering the convoy, we went and sank the ships. Well, that first ship that was sunk actually had about 1,450 men on it, allies, prisoners of war. And the Japanese, after it was sunk, picked up all their seamen, their naval officers and whatnot, and they left these men to die. As the Pomponido came through, they realized that these were our allies and immediately got on the radio signaling any other submarine in the area to come by and help them rescue. Before they left, the Pomponido picked up 73 men, both Australian and British prisoners of war, and 72 of them survived the trip back to Saipan, and they were all repatriated.
Joined later by Sea Lion, Queenfish, and Barb, the 4 submarines eventually rescued 159 survivors. More than 1,000 men were lost, swelling the ranks of other Allied POWs who suffered a similar fate. In late October 1944, as U.S. Marines struggled to gain the upper hand on Peleliu and Angaur in the Palau Group, General MacArthur's troops stormed ashore on Leyte in the central Philippines. Supporting the landing was the U.S. 3rd and 7th Fleets, which in turn were screened by submarines deployed to interdict a Japanese counterattack. Naval planners believed a move against the Philippines would force the remnants of the Imperial fleet into battle, and they were not disappointed. Within hours of the American landing, the Japanese combined fleet launched a complex three-pronged attack that would sacrifice what remained of their carrier force in order to annihilate the American landing at Leyte. But it was American submarines that drew first blood. Patrolling west of Palawan Island near midnight on October 22nd, the SJ radar sets aboard American submarines Darter and Dace detected the Japanese center force bound for San Bernardino Strait at a range of 30,000 yards. Darter and Dace pursued on the surface at full power with the intention of making a submerged attack at first light. Darter struck first, sinking the heavy cruiser Otago and damaging her sister ship Takao. Minutes later, Dace followed with a spread that sank Maya. In a separate attack west of Luzon, Bream disabled another Japanese cruiser, the Aoba. It would get little better for the Japanese. On the 24th, U.S. carrier aircraft badly mauled elements of the combined fleet in the Sibuyan Sea, while a U.S. force that included 5 salvaged battleships that had begun the war in the mud at Pearl Harbor annihilated the southern wing of the Japanese effort in Surigao Straits. It had been a rout, but as the Japanese hoped, Admiral Halsey then steamed off in pursuit of the carriers of the northern force, leaving San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. So it was that early on the morning of October 25th, the Japanese center force emerged from the strait and steamed southward along the coast of Samar toward the transport fleet at Leyte, opposed only by 16 slow and lightly armored escort carriers and their screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts. The Americans took a terrible beating as Japanese battleships sank 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and a destroyer escort. But such was the ferocity of the defense that the Japanese believed they were engaging major fleet units. As the battle raged, the Japanese attack, hampered by a combination of poor communications, lack of coordination, and above all the lack of air strength, wavered and then stalled. Although there was precious little to prevent it from blasting through to Leyte Gulf, the center force turned and headed back where it came from. Far to the north, Halsey found the Japanese carriers and sank all 4 of them, leaving what remained of the northern force to run a gauntlet back to Japan through several scouting lines of submarines, which succeeded in picking off a light cruiser and a destroyer. The battle for Leyte Gulf was the greatest naval fight in history, and when it was over, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. More than 30 boats from the Pacific and Southwest Pacific fleets participated, proving the viability of submarines operating with the fleet by not only providing crucial sighting reports, but by sinking or heavily damaging 6 enemy combatants. During 1944, more than 600 Japanese ships were credited to American submarines, and for the first time since the war had begun, the total included a significant number of enemy combatants. The United States and her allies had gained undisputed control of the Pacific Ocean, and the submarine force played a key role in the victory. The 1944's anti-shipping campaign was so successful that by the beginning of 1945, few enemy targets of any consequence remained. Unable to replace losses to its merchant fleet with new production, Japan was forced to employ small wooden fishing boats called sampans. Consequently, submarine skippers began thinning out the sampan fleet.
Toward the end of the war, you know, there were not as many steel ships out there, but more or less wooden. And sometimes we would take deck guns to those after we got the crews off. and would sink them at depth range.
During the closing stages of the war, submarines acted increasingly as submersible gunboats, pursuing the remaining quarry up and down the Japanese coast. Lifeguard duty became more commonplace as well, as air attacks on mainland targets grew in intensity.
The Navy had submarines spaced every 100, 200 miles above Iwo Jima. And then below Iwo Jima, then there'd be surface vessels, and they were all plotted, and you knew exactly where they were, and you had flimsies that tell you their coordinates. So if you had a problem, the idea was to ditch near them so you get picked up. Otherwise, it might be curtains. Of all the people that ditched in B-29s, I was lucky enough to be one of those.
U.S. submarines rescued more than 500 downed airmen during the war, including a young TBM pilot who would later become the 41st President of the United States. And while rescue missions were often routine, they were not without risk. The threat of air attack, whether by enemy or friendly forces, was a constant concern.
When these pilots ditch, why, their buddies are making runs on us too. I mean, they see a sub, and they were kind of careless, and they didn't make a distinction of who it was, and though we threatened those guys and say, hey, if you guys keep on doing this, we're going to leave your buddies underwater.
Although commerce raiding was the most obvious contribution submarines made in the defeat of Japan, secondary roles like lifeguard duty, photo reconnaissance, and mine clearing contributed greatly to the war effort. By April 1945, 120 U.S. submarines were operating in the Pacific. The Southwest Pacific Submarine Force had established a new advanced base at Subic Bay, west of Manila, and the headquarters of the Pacific Submarine Force had moved from Pearl Harbor to Guam. With Iwo Jima in possession of the Americans and the campaign to secure Okinawa just beginning, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Japan was finished, her war-making ability all but eliminated by the predations of American submarines on her merchant fleet and an endless stream of air raids on the home islands that crippled the civil and industrial infrastructure.
The effectiveness of strategic bombing has to be laid against the fact that most of those factories were not operating anywhere near their capacity because the supplies of raw materials coming in had been choked off, and also the ability of the Japanese to move completed goods, aircraft, tanks, to their overseas possessions was severely curtailed by the fact that the merchant fleet had virtually evaporated by that stage.
After 3.5 years, Japan, which had begun the war with 6 million tons of merchant shipping, could scrape together just 1,200,000 tons. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August marked the end of World War II. The formal surrender instrument was signed on the deck of USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd. Appropriately, Vice Admiral Lockwood participated in the ceremony with a dozen submarines and their tender anchored nearby.
The success of the submarines in World War II, I think, speaks for itself. No military service can compare with what was accomplished. With less than 2% of the Navy's personnel, they sunk 65% of all the Japanese ships sunk. That was the entire Japanese maritime fleet, plus 1/3 of its men of war, including the largest ship ever built.
We thought we got our revenge, and with the number of ships that we sunk. Like I say, the American submariners, they carried a fight to Japan.
The nature of the ship itself being a stealth ship to handle, easy to get out of a port and submerge and travel from one spot to another. They could penetrate further, probably not faster than a surface craft would, but surface craft didn't have the privilege of diving when an airplane would come along on a bombing run or anything like that. And therefore, I think with the few submarines that we had, we could manage to get further at sea, near their ports, and hit their shipping, whether it be merchant ship or military, and slowly cut them off from the things that were required.
The American submarine campaign during the Second World War was the most decisive victory of that war. In spite of a flawed pre-war doctrine and serious torpedo defects that severely limited effectiveness well into 1943, The United States Navy's submarine force nevertheless wrecked Japan's merchant fleet and sank a sizable chunk of the Imperial Navy. The Pacific submarine fleet revolutionized naval warfare and strangled Japan's home economy with a blockade that established a new adage: an island is a body of land surrounded by submarines.